Welcome and good evening. My name is Steve Schwartz. I'm the senior rabbi here at Bethel Congregation, and it is a great personal pleasure for me to welcome the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies for any kind of event, but especially a fabulous event like this. I have a dual role tonight, not only to welcome you on behalf of Bethel, but I'm a proud board member of the ICJS. And I guess I have a third role as well, which is to introduce the director of the ICJS, Dr. Chris Layton.
Many thanks, Steve, and deep thanks to the Bethel congregation for once again extending such warm hospitality that's a true trademark of this shul. We are afforded an uncommon opportunity in the United States that is far too often taken for granted. The opportunity to rub up against people who see the world very differently and to connect with them in spirited conversation about the challenges that pull us together and at times drive us apart. The challenge is to break the spell of lethargy, to inspire folks to step outside their bunkered enclaves, knowing full well that our religious communities, and I believe our academic institutions, their credibility hinges on the ability to enter into the fray, to translate lofty rhetoric into action, and to engage others whose understandings and experiences are alien to our own. Isolationism is simply no longer an option, and the way to dispel the enchantments of indifference depends upon daring educational encounters. This awareness prompted the board and staff of the ICJS to unanimously vote for the expanded scope of our mission to include Islam, and I am delighted to announce that we will welcome Dr. Hamira Ziad as our first Muslim scholar in September. I look forward to I believe that this bold move would delight Bernie Manekin and Jim Clark, who both recognize the imperative to disarm religious hostilities and took steps to thwart a long legacy of ignorance. Theirs is a story of a surprising friendship where individuals from divergent backgrounds came together and discovered that they brought out the best in one another. Their differences became a source of blessing. And so this evening's event is made possible by this bond of friendship, which we believe defines the core ethos of our organization. While Jim's poor health prevents him from being with us this evening, we are fortunate to have with us a good representation of Bernie's family, and God knows I miss Bernie every day. And I would like to ask them to stand and be recognized. Now to introduce tonight's program and to choreograph our conversation, I call upon Dr. Heather Rubens, our Roman Catholic scholar, who, along with our new Jewish scholar, Ben Sachs, were seasoned in the Windy City through their studies at the same institution from which tonight's speaker hails, namely the University of Chicago. So Heather, you're in charge now.
Thank you, Chris. A special thanks to the Manekin and Clark families for making this whole evening possible. It is my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. David Nirenberg. Dr. Nirenberg is the Deborah R. and Edgar D. Jannotta Professor in the Committee on Social Thought and the Director of the Neubauer Family Collegium for Culture and Society at the University of Chicago. Dr. Nirenberg's scholarly work is focused on the ways in which Jewish, Christian, and Islamic cultures constitute themselves both through real-world interactions with each other and in the world of ideas. His first book, Communities of Violence, Persecution of Minorities in the Middle Ages, is a detailed study of the social interactions between Jews, Christians, and Muslims within the context of Spain and France in order to understand the role that violence played in shaping the possibilities of coexistence. This is an amazing and important work of social history. It won awards from the American Historical Association, the Medieval Academy of America, and the Society for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies. Dr. Nirenberg is not only a brilliant social historian, but as this formidable book, Anti-Judaism, demonstrates, he is now known as an intellectual historian of great renown. As Michael Walzer points out in the New York Review of Books, quote, "Anti-Judaism is an extraordinary scholarly achievement. He seems to know everything. He deals only with literature he can read in the original language, but this isn't much of a limitation," unquote. While Dr. Nirenberg is still interested in interactions between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, he explores the work that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam do as figures in each other's thought. In Anti-Judaism, the Western tradition, published last year, David applied this methodology to a 3,000-year history, specifically exploring what work thinking about Jews and Judaism has done for pagan, Christian, Muslim, and secular thinkers. Dr. Nirenberg is chasing the hermeneutic Jew, or the imaginary Jew, through the history of ideas. Tonight's lecture is entitled Collision: Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nirenberg.
Let me just say first, it's not just an honor, it's actually an emotional moment for me to speak before so many friends, neighbors, colleagues, rabbis, people in whose kitchen I have met, people who have taught my son. It's a very emotional thing, so thank you so much for bringing me back and for being here. Let me tell you just a few words about how and why I began the book that Heather so graciously referred to and that Michael Walzer so wildly exaggerated the virtues of. I think I've had experiences like all of you have had, but the particular one I have in mind took place in September of 2001 when I lived in Baltimore. And I had to go to NYU to give a talk about Muslim, Christian, Jewish interactions, which is my specialty in the Middle Ages. Now, there was no air travel, not that I would have taken the flight, but there was no air travel, so when I got on the Amtrak train, it was full of politicians. John McCain sat right behind me, reading the Wall Street Journal. I have nothing to tell you about him because he just read the newspaper the whole way. But Richard Pearl sat to my right. And Richard Pearl spent the train ride calling Leslie Stahl and trying to convince her to interview Saddam Hussein and ask him why Saddam had bombed the Twin Towers, then calling the Defense Department and explaining how he was giving cover for Paul Wolfowitz, then calling his lobbying client. So I got off the train feeling that I was watching America's new fear. Remember, this was September 18th, 2001. And the reason the politicians were on the train, I think it was the 18th, is that they were going to Ground Zero to hear a speech by President Bush. I felt I was watching America's new fear, its new sense of uncertainty, its new sense that the world is an unpredictable and dangerous place, being given a face, and that face was the face of Saddam Hussein. Now, I didn't write a book called Anti-Sadamism, the Western tradition, because I then got on the subway. And the subway train was empty, but there were two people on it other than me. A welder going to Ground Zero to participate in the cleanup effort, was no longer a rescue, and his friend. And they were talking about why this had happened, why 9/11 had happened. And the answer they gave each other was, well, one of them said, it's the Jews, because they killed Jesus. It's because the Jews killed Jesus that they, the Muslims in the world, hate us. The other one said, yes, and their greed. It's Jewish greed that has turned Manhattan into a symbol of greed, and that's why they hate us. Now, as a medievalist, I'm sure many people have had, I could multiply those experiences because I had many more like that, and I'm sure some of you have had as well. But what struck me on that moment in the train was, as a medievalist, these explanations were familiar to me. That is to say, I could easily imagine, in fact, I had written about people making similar explanations in 1348, when the plague came to Europe, or in other periods of the Middle Ages. So on the one hand, I was struck by the familiarity of these explanations for why the world was suddenly radically challenging, dangerous, unpredictable. And on the other hand, I was also struck by the differences, meaning so sameness and difference, it was a theme of the seminar we had today at ICJS. How can it be that an idea that has this form, the Jews, can change and adapt so readily to make sense of totally different circumstances, such as the 21st century? Now, to answer a question like that, which is also to answer the question of, well, the question many of us often, I think, have posed to each other, why the Jews, or why anti-Semitism, or why the Holocaust, or what's the relation? To answer a question like that, you have to be able to take seriously both the continuity of the form, that is, how it is that thinking about Judaism has been so useful for so long, and also take seriously the way in which it changes. You can't treat it as something fixed, something eternal, something essential. Otherwise, how would it be able to make sense of such changing circumstances? So I set out to try to understand how this concept has made so much sense of the world for so many people. Now, I could have started this story in many different places. For example, I could have started the story in the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible is marked by many attempts to understand why bad things happen in terms of bad Jews. Just think of how Deuteronomy tells you, if you do things right, things will go well, and if you do things wrong, things will go badly. And so much of the Hebrew Bible is an attempt to show you just how hard it is to get it right, and just how badly things go when you get it wrong. So I could have started there, and that self-critical aspect of the Hebrew Bible is one of the things that became the building blocks for anti-Judaism. But I didn't start there. I could have started in Greece. I could have started with the Greek differentiation between matter and spirit, and the Greek tendency to be suspicious, the Greek philosophical tendency to be suspicious of the material world and think that the true lies beyond the material world. A suspicion that you know will later be mapped onto the Jews, and the Jews will come to stand for the false material world. But I didn't start there. I started in ancient Egypt. I could have started in Babylon, because Babylonia had to think a lot about Jews. They didn't leave many records of their thinking about Jews. And anyway, I don't read those funny writing things, so I didn't start there. I started in Egypt in part to show that this was something that to some degree independent of Christianity and its children, or of Islam as well. And I won't tell you too much about Egypt, because I know that today's focus is on Christianity and Islam. But I did want to begin with an example that showed that this ability to think with Judaism about the world didn't depend on Christianity or Islam. And I found it very interesting to discover for myself, I'm sure there were Egyptologists who already knew this, that Judaism was very good to think with in Egypt, so that Egyptians explained to themselves many things that had nothing obvious to do with Jews, such as drought, such as invasion by Persians, invasion by Greeks, invasion by Romans, such as higher taxes in terms of Judaism. So much so that when Egyptian ambassadors went to Roman emperors like Claudius or Commodus and to complain about taxation, they did so by calling the emperors Jews. "What are you, a three-penny Jew?" says one ambassador to Claudius. Now, this meant a lot to them because they were risking their lives. In fact, every one of those ambassadors was killed for calling the emperor a Jew. And of course, you also know the emperor wasn't Jewish. So what did it mean for them? How could it meaningfully make sense of their world and the challenges they faced in their world to think in terms of Judaism? That was what I set out to explore in the Egyptian chapter. But of course, ancient Egypt is not the future of the Western tradition. And for that, I had to turn to Christianity and Islam, where, for however useful anti-Judaism was for Egyptians, it became absolutely central to the ways in which these other religions the great religions of the Mediterranean, came to make sense of the world. Now, why is that? Well, it's not very mysterious in some sense, that a religion like Christianity, that is in some sense claiming the Jewish tradition for itself and claiming to have a better interpretation of it, to have a truer interpretation of it, needs to make sense of its relationship to Judaism. And we can see that sense happening everywhere in the New Testament. The New Testament is, to a large degree, a kind of pedagogical text about how you have to read the old traditions in a new way if you want to be an adherent of the new faith and the new Messiah. So think, for example, of the beautiful story in the Synoptic Gospels. I feel a little we're in a synagogue, but of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. The road to Emmaus is the modern Abu Ghosh outside of Jerusalem. So they're walking from Jerusalem to Abu Ghosh, not for the hummus, which is meant to be the best hummus in Israel. Although, of course, when you see the supper at Emmaus, it's almost always painted as a dining room, Caravaggio or Rubens, and there are many paintings of it. But the issue, the point of the story is not the food. The point of the story is the disciples on the road. And the disciples on the road are very sad. And a third figure approaches them and says, "Why are you so sad?" And they say, "You must be the only person who has not heard about the events in Jerusalem of Jesus of Nazareth, whom we thought was the Savior of Israel. And we're very disappointed because he obviously wasn't, because he was crucified." And the third figure then begins to explain to them, no. You don't understand. It had to be so. And he proceeded, say the Gospels, to reinterpret for them the entire prophetic tradition to show them why, if read correctly, that his crucifixion and his messiahship was predicted. So you can see how the Quran does the same thing. In fact, the second surah of the Quran is not put in the order in which it was revealed, but if you open it and start reading from page 1, the second surah, for example, is a long engagement with the previous people of the book, in particular with the Jews, and their erroneous readings of scriptures. So the Quran too, just like the New Testament, has to show why its claim to interpret the prophetic tradition is correct and why the Jews' claim is not. And in order to do so, it has to really know the Jewish tradition. In fact, at one moment in Surah 2, the Quran says, "O you people of the book, do you not remember when we raised above you the mount and said, 'Take this law, or here you will find your death'? And they said, 'We hear and we disobey.'" Now you know that that's not actually in the Torah. But it is in the Talmud. The story of God holding the mountain like an inverted cask over the people of Israel and saying, "If you do not accept my law, here you will find your death," is a Talmudic story. And the Quran knows this. More than that, it knows that in Hebrew you say, "Shamanu va'asinu," we hear and we do. And in Arabic you say, "Samanu wa'asaina," we hear and we disobey. So it builds a pun out of the similar sound between Arabic and Hebrew, and it borrows a Talmudic story to make the pun work. In other words, you can see the Quran itself working with the tradition, the Jewish tradition, not just the Torah, but also the rabbinic tradition, in order to show why it has the right interpretation. So for these religions, Judaism and Judaizing came to mean a mistaken way of relating to the world and to the prophetic word, to God's word. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about that mistaken way and about the word I just used, Judaizing, because I think Judaizing is the key issue to understanding why thinking about Judaism has so much power in both Christianity and Islam, and then in the secular cultures that followed. The mistaken relationship that Christians and Muslims imagined Jews had and had to create for Jews in order to appropriate their scriptures came to mean a mistaken way of relating to the world, like being overly materialistic, a mistaken way of relating to the text, being overly literal, a mistaken way of relating to the law, being overly legalistic. These are all stereotypes are applied to Jews. But they're equally often applied, in fact, they're much more often applied by Christians and Muslims against each other than they are against Jews. Let me tell you how that happened. It happened already in the very earliest Christian texts. In fact, one of the earliest texts we have is Paul's epistle to the Galatians. And in Paul's epistle to the Galatians, there's this formative moment in the early Christian community in which Peter and Paul meet to decide how Gentile converts to Judaism should behave. And the question is, should they have to observe Jewish law of circumcision and of kashrut, or should they not have to observe Jewish law, because Gentiles following Jesus? Peter says they have to observe Jewish law, and Paul says, Peter, you hypocrite. He uses the word hypocrite. And then the church fathers spent centuries debating what it can mean for one apostle to call another one a hypocrite. You hypocrite, why do you who do not live as a Jew force the Gentiles, we're not talking about Jews, we're talking about Gentiles, force the Gentiles to Judaize? The word he used was judaising in Greek, judaizare in the Latin translation. And you guys, when you read it in English Bible, you usually read to live as Jews. But to Judaize is a lot stronger than that. And what Paul essentially did in that, by coining that verb, was he essentially he put a Jew in every Christian's head as a critic of what the Christian is doing. What did he mean by Judaize? He meant to put too much faith in the law, circumcision, kashrut. To put too much faith in the flesh. He kept on saying to put the faith in flesh is death, right? And you need to put it in the spirit. Circumcision is faith in the flesh. To put too much faith in the letter, right? To read literally, if you read literally, it means you have to be circumcised on the 8th day. To read literally is to Judaize. So Paul essentially said to Christians, when you put too much faith in the world, when you put too much emphasis on the law or on the letter, you are acting like a Jew. So he turned Judaism into a basic critical concept with which Christians could criticize each other, as he was criticizing Peter, and could criticize themselves. To summarize the whole concept, let me just quote from a poem written by a poet who had never seen a Jew in his life, who lived in England where there were no Jews in the 1630s, hadn't been for 300 years. So George Herbert, a very important English poet, Protestant poet, who's sitting here saying, okay, how do I represent how I as a Christian have to criticize myself and my engagement with the world? And he called the poem Self-Condemnation. And he said, he that doth love, and love amiss this world's delights, before true Christian joy, hath made a Jewish choice and is a Judas Jew. Now the point there is the confusion. If I as a Christian, if I love my wife too much, so I don't mean to, I'm not picking on you, I'm being dramatic. Or if I'm too attached to my money, or to my house, or to earthly beauty wherever I see it, I've just become a Judas Jew. Now, the reason this is so important is it helps, it's a concept that can help Christians make sense of their world and of why things go wrong in their world, regardless of whether there are Jews in that world. Muslims did the same thing. In Islam, the concept of the hypocrite, much like the Pharisee in early Christianity, the concept of the hypocrite, the munafiqun, was developed in order to make sense of why sometimes things look good but are bad, why sometimes why the world doesn't actually look like what it is, why bad things can happen to good people, you might say. So it's this power of criticizing any and every Christian or Muslim's activities as Jewish that turned anti-Judaism into a key concept of the Western tradition. And it's still a key concept of the Western tradition. If you think to yourselves, who in the Muslim world today suffers most from anti-Judaism? It's not the Jews. There are very few Jews living in Muslim countries today. But you hear secular Muslims, reformist Muslims, any Muslim that another Muslim disagrees with, being accused of Judaizing, of Zionizing, of being Jews. And people pay with their lives for that. Anwar Sadat was killed as a Jew. Today in the Syrian civil war, all sides in that civil war accuse each other of being Jews. So the Baathists accuse Al-Qaeda of being Jews and lovers of Israel because attacking the Syrian government. Al-Qaeda, of course, attacks the materialist atheist dictator, as they call him, as being a Jew. That's what makes the concept so useful. It's not just its utility against real Jews. Now, in the book, I try to show you thousands of examples, that's why it's 632 pages long, of how things become Jewish. And that's a really important word, Jewish. And we're not talking about real Jews. How does eggplant become Jewish? In Spain, in the 16th century, cities sue each other over who should be called eggplant eater. None of them are Jewish. They're all old Christian. In fact, the most important Christian cities of Spain are suing each other to say, you have to put an eggplant on your flag because you're more Jewish than we are. How does that eggplant come to China? Now, I'm not going to bore you with eggplant, but there are pages on this. Well, there's a footnote on eggplant. But let me tell you about something, an example of this thinking with Judaism that's much more central to our own experience, because it's a much more common, it's an icon of our culture. Well, eggplant's kind of an icon of our culture, but Shakespeare. In The Merchant of Venice, you see how one of the most creative figures of his day, Shakespeare, is who is living in England that has not seen a real Jew, for 300 years, is trying to make sense of rapid change in his own world. So, for example, what are those changes? Well, one is the rise of his art form itself. Theater is a new art form. And it's an art form that's highly suspect because it looks, well, it's all about appearance rather than about being, which in a Christian system of thought is a very bad thing. It's Pharisaic. It's all about trading words for money. The first ticket ever sold for a theater performance in Europe was sold in Shakespeare's generation. So he's taking place, his whole art is a kind of Jewish art, which is why the Protestants closed the theaters whenever they could. And they attacked it as a Jewish art form. He's worrying about money lending. England in Shakespeare's day has just legalized usury. Shakespeare's father went to jail twice for lending money at interest. But all of a sudden, lending money at interest is legal. What makes this practice, this Christian practice, different from the Jewish usury practice that his father had gone to jail for? They're living through a revolution in commerce. Mercantilism is becoming very important. Merchants had been a stigmatized class before. Now all of a sudden they're in charge of the government. They're in charge of the country. What differentiates the merchants buy low, sell high from the moneylender? Law is undergoing a revolution. Contracts are undergoing. How does Shakespeare think about all of this and stage it in a way that his audience can understand? Through Shylock. So he creates a figure of Judaism which represents the wrong position, or at least a complicated position that needs to be explored, that can be juxtaposed to the Christian, to establish what he says over and over again in the play, to establish the difference in our spirits. That is the difference between Christian and Jew. Now, this is very hard for us moderns. When we read Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, we think, is it anti-Semitic, is it not? But that's not the point. The point for Shakespeare is that the thinking about Judaism is a great way of thinking about Christianity, which is why there's a line in the play that's very hard for us moderns to understand when we stage it. And I watched the Al Pacino production in Broadway, and they cut this line, which I think is it's the only line they cut that I could tell. And it's the most important line in the whole play. Do you remember when Portia shows up at the courtroom as a judge? Judge Heller? She shows up as a judge. And the first thing she says is, which is the Christian here and which the Jew? Now, from the point of view of the analysis I've just been giving you, that makes total sense, because the Christian's job in the world is to establish how they're not Jewish in Shakespeare's world, even though there are no Jews in society. But when you stage this play today, you think, I can't have that line. It's obvious who the Jew is. The Jew is the guy with the sidelocks and the knife on stage and the big nose. Shylock was usually produced with a big nose. And the Christian is the good guy. So I think Shakespeare's a great example of how a society puts Judaism to work to think about its most important problems and challenges, even when there are no Jews in that society. The Enlightenment did not put an end to this process. Secularization did not put an end to this process, partly because the process was so deeply imbued in the thinking patterns, the thinking strategies, the habits of thought of Europe. So, for example, all sides in the Enlightenment, that is, the sides defending the church, the sides defending traditional aristocracy, or the radical philosophes on the other side, those attacking Catholicism as superstition, those attacking the aristocracy as unjust, all saw each other as Jewish. So much so that when a philosopher or Enlightenment critic writes a book against the aristocracy, against the monarchy, or against the priesthood, they cast the struggle in terms of Judaism. I'll just cite from one of them. The Baron d'Holbach in 1770, he sounds a little bit like Marx. He exhorts Europe, all of Europe. He says, "Dare, O Europe, break the unbearable yoke of prejudice by which you are afflicted." And what does he call the book? The Spirit of Judaism. Now, there are no Jews. The Jewish population of France in 1770 is 0.0015% of the population. This is not about real Judaism. It's about imagining the revolution that has to take place in terms of a revolution against Judaism. And when the French Revolution comes along, all sides involved imagine it as a revolution against Judaism. So on the one hand, the enemies of the revolution, like Edmund Burke, the great defender of the American Revolution, say things like, the French Revolution is the victory of the Jew jobbers and stockbrokers over the aristocracy of Europe. Again, there's no Jews involved in the French Revolution, very few. On the other hand, the defenders of the French Revolution, like Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the great German philosopher, say the opposite. They say the French Revolution is the victory of nobility over Judaism. This debate made its way into every aspect of modern philosophy. Kant sees his system of thought as an emancipation of reason from Judaism. Hegel looks at Kant and says Kant is a Jew. In fact, in one of Hegel's early writings, he writes the whole history of philosophy in terms of the history of Christianity, and he has the Sermon on the Mount, and he places Kant amongst the Pharisees at the Sermon on the Mount. Along comes Schopenhauer and looks at Hegel and says Hegel's philosophy is a rabbinic enema. I don't write this stuff, I just report it. A rabbinic enema. Now, these are not just insults. They're actually, the work that they're doing philosophically is Judaism, and anti-Judaism is central to the work they're doing. Why am I stressing all of this? I'm stressing all of this because if we don't understand the way in which anti-Judaism is actually about how we've learned to think about the world, we can't understand how it can be so compelling as an explanation of that world to so many people. If you entered Europe in 1900 or 1910 and you looked around the university, there's not a single department of the university, from physics to biology to art history, that wasn't thinking about its own discipline in terms of the overcoming of Judaism. You open a physics textbook from the beginning of the 20th century by the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, most important physicist of the day, most important textbook, and it begins by saying, mathematics is very popular in physics nowadays, think of Einstein, but you must not let young physicists study too much mathematics because it will Judaize them and alienate them from their organic experimental capabilities. You look at mathematical journals. They're all about, some of them are about, purging Jewish mathematics from non-Jewish mathematics. What does Jewish mathematics mean? Well, actually, it means specific things, and we could talk about what it means. You open an art history textbook, and it's all about criticizing art in terms of its Judaism. Now, of course, you know that these kinds of ideas were eventually put to work by the Nazis. Think of, for example, the great Nazi degenerate art exhibition, the Entartete Kunst exhibit of, was it 1937? The most successful art exhibit in modern history until something in New York in the 1980s. 100 and something painters, artists, condemned there as Jewish and degenerate. Only 6 Jews, even by the Nazi definition of race. The others were Jews in the sense that I'm trying to describe of Judaizing. Judaizing by the critical art historical discourse that the Germans, and not only the Germans, had developed. The same is true in music or any other discipline. And what I'm trying to say is, it's only if we understand how this system of thought could make critical sense. I'm not talking about be a system of thought for the stupid, or for the ignorant, or for the poor, but make critical sense, be a system of thought for the most intelligent people in Europe trying to make sense of their world. Only if we understand that can we understand how a society, and not just Germany, but all of Europe, could become convinced that the most pressing challenges of their age could best be addressed by overcoming Judaism in the sense of exterminating it. So really, my book is a book about the power of ideas. It's a book about taking seriously how the history of our thought affects how we see our world, affects how we think of what we have to do in this world. Not how we think just in terms of, again, not in terms of ignorance or prejudice. I'm not treating anti-Judaism as the socialism of fools or of the poor. I'm actually treating it as a system of thought that has been capable of making critical sense of the world for Muslims and Christians and secular philosophers and intellectuals of all types in a way that was convincing. And it's only if we understand it's only if we understand the history of thought that we can begin to ask, well, how did this history affect our present day? Or how might it affect the way I see the world, or the way my neighbors see the world, or the way my critics see the world? I think we live in an age today in which, once again, millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people, are being told that the most critical conflicts, the most grave injustices, the most important problems, the greatest uncertainties confronting them in their own lives today can be understood in terms of Israel, or in terms of Judaism, or in terms of Jewish questions. Now, I know that very often when people say history can help us here, it's dismissed as merely an apology for whatever Israel is doing. And often it is just that. But I think the opposite danger is much greater. The danger of not being aware of how the history of how we've been thinking, of how we've been taught to think, of how our traditions have taught us to think, not being aware of how that shapes our sense of the world is a much more dangerous ignorance than asking history to help us. It's true. I'm not making a deterministic argument here. I'm not saying that how we've thought about Judaism, how the West and Islam and how history has taught us to think about Judaism determines how we see the world. I'm just saying that it's our task to try and be aware of how it might shape the way we see the world. I do think that we as people in the world make history. We can shape the world. We can remake the world in new ways. But I don't think we can make it just as we please. We don't make it independently of the kinds of habits of thought that we've developed and that our ancestors have developed. So I don't think we can live without a consciousness of that history. The history, in this case, of anti-Judaism. And that's why I wrote this book. I really look forward to the conversation with Heather, and then to the conversation with you all. Thank you.
So one of the great attributes of this book is the fact that it can be read cover to cover, if you've got, a weekend. While at the same time, the chapters can also be read independently. A reader can easily sort of move from your introduction to the chapter on Shakespeare, and then move to the section on Egypt, and look at anti-Judaism on a sort of case-by-case basis. That being said, you made the choice to present the chapters chronologically, and thereby, I think, point to an inherited tradition of anti-Judaism. So perhaps this is an unfair question to ask a historian, but I believe it is one that your book invites. Namely, what do you think the future is of anti-Judaism in Western thought? What do you see as the different paths sort of leading forward? What kind of work could Judaism do going forward? What's possible? What's desirable?
Wow. No, it's just, prophecy is way beyond the pay grade of the historian. But actually, I should take that back. I think that the historian always has to be part prophet. And the reason I say that is that historians can ask all kinds of questions of their material. So I could have looked at the past and I could have said, it's really interesting how Christianity, Islam, many secular thinkers have looked at Judaism for positive examples. I could have written a book about philo-Semitism. Why didn't I? Obviously I didn't, because I had a sense of which question was more urgent, which question was more important for our present, which is also to say which question is more important for our future. So clearly, I think that, and I wrote this book, although I didn't write in the book about this, clearly I think that we do live in moments in which how we think about the world is very much conditioned by the kinds of habits of thought I described in the book. Now, if you ask me, what does that mean for what's going to happen next week, or what's going to happen in 20 years, or what the future of the state of Israel is, or what the future of the diaspora is, I can't answer. I can only tell you that my prophetic sense, and historians are pretty poor prophets, my prophetic sense led me to think that we need to start thinking critically about these ideas. Now, if I were an incredible narcissist, I'd tell you that a book like this can change the future. Clearly, you would all laugh at me. On the other hand, I wouldn't write the book if I didn't think, just like the ICJS wouldn't do its work if the ICJS didn't think that studying these questions, becoming critically aware of them, engaging them, can help stimulate a kind of self-consciousness at an individual level, at a local level, at a national or even global level that can help make for different futures. So without giving an answer to what the specific future looks like, I can only tell you that I was clearly worried, but that I do think that the only tool we have as prophets is to warn. It's not given to us to decide how people will react to our warning, as God said to another prophet, much better prophet, I think it was Jonah. It's only given to us to try express our sense of what the challenges facing the world today are.
What work has anti-Judaism done in Jewish thought, in your opinion? How has sort of this work been in dialogue with the various anti-Judaisms you've identified and explored?
You don't ask any easy questions. It's a really interesting question, and many people have explored it. Many people have written about it. You may know Sandra Gilman, for example, on Jewish self-hatred. And many people have thought that the Jewish Haskalah, for example, was born out of a kind of internalization or ventriloquization of Christian critiques of Judaism in an attempt to change Judaism. Certainly, there have been movements, mystical movements within Judaism that were taking, in some sense, even the pietists of the Rhineland who started the medieval Jewish mysticism were very much in conversation with Christian views of Judaism, and were articulating a piety that was a reaction to that. In fact, if you follow people like Daniel Boyarin, the Talmudist at Berkeley, Rabbinic Judaism as a whole, the Talmud, the entire way of thinking rabbinically, was a reaction to Christian Christian images of Judaism, to the Christian view of what Judaism is. So in that sense, you could say, if you want to go that far, I don't know how many of you know Daniel Boyarin. He is one of the most important Talmudists writing today, but he's probably most famous for his appearance in the movie Footnote, which if you haven't seen, you should see. A great Israeli film. But in any event, you could go so far as to say that all Rabbinic Judaism is in some sense an engagement with anti-Judaism. But I don't want to name names or point fingers, because there have been people who've argued that Reform Judaism is this. There have been people who argue that Marxism is this. That many things have been called forms of Jewish self-hatred or forms of Jewish appropriation, absorption of anti-Judaism. And I think in some sense there's some truth to all of those, and in other sense that's a way of dismissing them and criticizing them that is also false.
I'll ask one more question, slightly easier, before opening it up to the floor. So with a work of this magnitude and the fact that you devoted 10 years of your life to bringing this book about, your own thinking about this topic has surely changed or sort of developed along the way. What's been the most surprising change in your own thinking that this project has brought about?
Well, I finished the book and I said, damn, I was wrong. This whole book is wrong. I've changed my mind, but I have to publish it anyway. What am I going to do with 10 years of work? I think I began this book as a polemic. I was on a panel at UCLA with a very important European philosopher, and it seemed to me that his philosophy, the way he was, and its popularity in the present world, was a symptom of something terribly wrong in the way people were thinking about Judaism and in the way people were thinking about the world, and that this book had to be written. And I called, I called an agent, and the first agent said, oh, I don't think we need a book about anti-Judaism, we need a book about anti-Islamism. And that may be true, but it just wasn't the book I wanted to write. Over the period, finally I found an agent who was willing and a publisher who was willing, and I started to write. And over that period, I think I realized that this is much less a polemic and much more a way of cultural criticism. That is much more a way of making sense of many of the most beautiful things and the highest values of our society. Now, those high values and beautiful things, like Shakespeare, or like idealist philosophy, or like turn out to be mixed, right? To be built out of what I call anti-Judaism. So that the notion of that intermixedness, both of our highest values, of what we most treasure as a society, but we think makes us most capable of interpreting the world well and beautifully, with this thing that I see as so problematic, so dangerous, and even think of it as in some way threatening to me as an individual, that interpenetration was the most surprising thing.